Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Exploring Marketing Research, Chapter number 11, Part 2, Experimental Research. After studying this part, you should be able to know ways of minimizing experimental demand characteristics, understand the advantages of between subjects experimental design, weigh the trade-off between internal and external validity. Controlling extraneous variables. The fourth decision about basic elements of an experiment concerns control over extraneous variables. This is related to the various types of experimental error. In Chapter 8, we classify total survey error into two basic categories, random sampling error and systematic error. The same dichotomy applies to all research design, but the terms random sampling error and systematic errors are more frequently used when discussing experiments. Controlling extraneous variables. Constant error is like a distorting mirror in a fun house. It produces a picture that is clear but incorrect. Random error is like a mirror that has become cloudy with age. It produces a picture that is essentially correct but unclear. Controlling extraneous variables deals with elimination of extraneous variables, consistency of conditions, order representation, blinding, random assignment. Controlling extraneous variables. The first one is elimination of extraneous variables. Most students of marketing realize that marketing mix variables, price, product, promotion, and distribution interact with uncontrollable factors in the market, such as competitors' activities and consumer trends. Thus, the marketing experiments are subject to the effect of extraneous variables. Since extraneous variables can produce confounded results, they must be identified before the experiment if at all possible. The second thing in controlling external variable is consistency of conditions. When extraneous variables cannot be eliminated, experimenters may strive for consistency of conditions. This means that subjects in all experimental groups are exposed to identical conditions except for the differing experimental treatments. The principle of matching discussed earlier helps make sure that consistency is achieved. Controlling extraneous variables. The next factor is order of presentation. If an experimental method requires that the same subjects be exposed to the two or more experimental treatments, an error may occur due to the order of presentation. For instance, if subjects are examining the effects of different levels of graphical interface on video game enjoyment, and they are asked to view each of four different levels, the order in which they are presented may influence enjoyment. Subjects might perform one level simply because it follows a very poor level. Controlling extraneous variables. The next factor is elimination of extraneous variables. And we can control the extraneous variable by eliminating extraneous variable with the help of consistency of conditions, order representation, blinding, random assignment. The next factor is eliminate extraneous variables, hold conditions constant, and we can do randomization with the help of matching subjects as well. Demand characteristics. The term demand characteristics refers to an experimental design element that unintentionally provides subjects with hints about the research hypothesis. Researchers cannot reveal the research hypothesis to subjects before the experiment, or else they can create a confounding effect. Demand characteristics. Think about the retail atmospheric experiment. If the subjects were told before They participated that they were going to be involved in an experiment to see if they liked stores that were predominantly if they liked stores that were predominantly orange or predominantly blue. The researcher would never be sure if their responses to the dependent variable were really due to the differences in the experimental stimuli or due to the fact that the subjects were trying to provide a correct response. Demand characteristics. In addition, once subjects know the hypothesis, there is little hope that they will respond naturally. So, knowledge of the experimental hypothesis creates a confound. This particular type of confound is known as demand effect. Demand characteristics make demand effects very likely. Field versus laboratory experiment. A marketing experiment can be conducted in a natural setting, a fixed experiment, a field experiment, or in an artificial or laboratory setting. In social sciences, the actual laboratory may be a behavioral lab, which is somewhat like a focus group facility. However, it may simply be a room or classroom dedicated to collecting data, or it can even take place in one's home. In a laboratory experiment, the researcher has more complete control over the research setting and extraneous variables. Field versus laboratory experiment. Field experiments are research projects involving experimental manipulations that are implemented in a natural environment. They can be useful in fine-tuning marketing strategies and determining sales forecasts for different marketing mix designs. Test markets are field experiments. Field versus laboratory experiments. Betty Crocker's squeeze it a 10% fruit juice drink in a squeeze bottle was so successful in the test market that production could not keep up with the demand. As a result, the product's national introduction was postponed until production capacity could be increased. Laboratory experiment and field experiment. This exhibits differentiate between these two experiments. In laboratory experiment, artificial and laboratory experiment is artificial low realism, while field experiment is natural high realism. In laboratory experiment, few extraneous variables, while in field experiment, many extraneous variables are present. In laboratory experiment, researcher has high control while researcher has low control in field experiment. Laboratory experiment has low cost while field experiment has high cost. Laboratory experiment can have short duration while field experiments can have long duration. In laboratory experiments, subjects are aware of participation while subjects are unaware of participation in field experiment. So one can see the difference between these two experiments. When does an experiment have internal validity? Internal validity means the ability of an experiment to answer the question whether the experimental treatment was the sole cause of changes in a dependent variable. So one can ask a question for internal validity. Did the manipulation do what it was supposed to do? Factors that can influence internal validity are history, maturation, testing, instrumentation, selection, mortality. I will explain one by one. So factors influencing internal validity. Let's talk about first history. A history effect occurs when some change other than the experimental treatment occurs during the course of an experiment that affects the dependent variable. A common history effect occurs when competitors change their marketing strategies during a test marketing experiment. Maturation. Maturation effects are effects that are a function of time and the naturally occurring events that coincide with growth and experience. Experiments taking place over longer time spans may see lower internal validity as subjects simply grow older or more experienced. Testing. Testing effects are called pre-testing effects because the initial measurement or test alerts are prime subjects in a way that affects their response to the experimental treatments. Testing effects only occur in a before and after study. Instrumentation. A change in the wording of questions, a change in interviewers, or a change in other procedures used to measure the dependent variable causes an instrumentation effect, which may jeopardize internal validity. If the same interviewers are used to ask questions for both before and after measurement, some problems may arise. With practice, interviewers may acquire increased skill in interviewing, or they may become bored and decide to reword the questionnaire in their own terms. Selection. Selection is a factor that influences internal validity. The selection effect is a sample bias that results from different selection of respondents for the comparison groups. Our sample selection error discussed earlier. Mortality is another factor that influences internal validity. If an experiment is conducted over a period of a few weeks or more, some sample bias may occur due to the mortality effect, sample attrition. Sample attrition occurs when some subjects withdraw from the experiment before it is completed. Motility effects may occur if subjects drop from one experimental treatment group disproportionately from other groups. What are the different basic experimental design? So here are some basic experimental design. Classic experimental designs are one-shot design, one group, pre-test, post-test, and static group design. These are the three experimental design which can be used for the experiments in marketing research. Thank you. That's all for part 2.